John chapter 8, verses 28 through 32. So Jesus said to them, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am He, and that I do nothing on my own authority, but speak just as the Father taught me. And He who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to Him." As He was saying these things, many believed in Him. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed Him, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free."
Good morning. It's great to see everyone gathered here in our rooms, and welcome all of our campuses that are meeting, as well as most of you who are participating online. We're so grateful to be together. I believe that there is a deep ache in all of us, something that we know something is just not right, it's gone off the rails, whether you think it's more current or it's been around for a long time. And I think that brings up in us just a desire, or maybe even what feels like a futile desire, that we ought to live differently than we do. That something ought to be different than we do. And what happens is we seem to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and we just stay stuck. Just stuck. For some of you, you're stuck in your personal life, in your thought life, in your habit life. For others of you, it's in a family system. The same arguments with your spouse, the same arguments with your kids is just over and over again. For some of you, it's just the same bouts with the same struggles that you've always had. For others of you, it gets more and more sort of spread out from there. Even as a collection of people, as a nation, it just seems to be the same thing over and over again. We're just stuck. And we hear Jesus say something like, "Hey, you're going to know that God sent me when I'm lifted up." He's talking about His death. And then He says this incredible truth. He says that you will know that you are disciples, right? If you keep my word. If you keep my word, you will be my disciple. And what we read it as, if you do what I say, then you'll be like accepted by me. And it's not, it's something else. Because then He goes on, He says, then you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. He goes on that passage and says, if the Son of Man sets you free, you are free indeed. These are big, sweeping statements, but a lot of us have grown up thinking about, and we're talking about this in this series, these two systems, one that operates under the rule of law, and the other that I've been sort of hammering for the better part of 3 years is this idea of the rule of God's love, the rule of love of Hesed. And we're bringing it in to bear on these four kind of problems or issues or realities that exist in a fallen world. And the first one is poverty. We spoke about that a couple of weeks ago. The second one is brokenness. We spoke about that last week. And today we're going to be talking about this idea of bondage, things that keep us stuck. And then next week we'll talk about this idea of perspective and not being able to see. But these four things, and we're talking about this, and how these two rules sort of weigh in on this. And part of what I think happens to us is that we continue to try to figure out how to make this system work. And so when we hear, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free," what we do is we take that as a call to go, here's what the truth is. The truth is actually evidence, and let me prove to you why this is right. Do you see how problematic that is? You're trying to use something in one system to prove that's something in another system, and that's not at all how this works. What we've got to begin to understand, we talk about things about Jesus and His way. What we've got to prepare ourselves for is this is unlike anything we were prepared to see, and it is going to look so unfamiliar to us, we're scarcely going to even recognize it. Like Tom Brady in a Buccaneers uniform. You know how hard this thing was to get? I'd have it overnight shipped from a friend in High Point to get it here. So shout out to my friend Jonathan Robert who got it here. And so Tom Brady in a Buccaneers jersey, it just looks weird. For those of you who don't know, Tom Brady, perhaps the best quarterback to ever play the game. Y'all know this, right? If you're a Patriots fan, you're like half on board with what I'm saying because you're not sure what I'm about to do with this sacrament that is up here. But Tom Brady is like, we look at them. Tom Brady has been for probably 45 years playing the NFL, and he's been a Patriot, and he's won who knows how many. He's won 6 Super Bowls over a giant span of time. He's 43 years old, been playing for the Patriots like they win the Super Bowl every stinking year, unless you're a Patriots fan. You're like, they win every single year. It's like the standard in the NFL. Tom Brady's like the standard for a quarterback. He might actually be the standard for masculinity, but that's a whole other conversation. And all of a sudden last year, he's at the end of his contract, and he gets traded to the Buccaneers. And you're looking at this, you're going, this just looks weird. I think Tom Brady even stands in the mirror and goes, this looks weird. And so what you got to understand is when I'm talking about this way of Jesus, you're going to try to do everything you can to put it into this category. Why? Because you are familiar with it. It has always been this way. It kind of gives you a sense of comfort and peace. But something has fundamentally changed, and it's unlike anything that you were prepared for or saw coming. And the way in which we embrace this reality is fundamentally different than anything that you currently think in this system. Now, the beautiful thing about this and what I've been talking about, I've had a lot of great conversations, but that all of us, we operate within a reality, within a domain, within a rule. There is some reason why you feel licensed to do the things that you do, and there's some reason why you feel restriction on not doing things. There's something that governs, something that rules your emotions, your heart, why you say, I shouldn't do this or I should do that. Why you want to do this and why you don't want to do that. There's something that rules us. Somebody has the right to tell you that something is wrong. That's true for everybody. So there's a system that is in play. Some of us like it and some of us don't. Some of us win in it and some of us lose in it. And what happens is in this system, these things run like this. The system of law is really an evidence-proof loop. Even the way you relate to other people, this is not just systematic. And when we think about our government systems or world systems, it's also the way we enter into relationships. We have a prove evidence. You want to make sure that you are doing what is necessary to continue to prove to this person that you are worthy of their time and their attention and whatever it might be. As a child, trying to appease your parents, making sure you do good in school or making sure you perform at this level or perform in sports. Perhaps you're in a relationship and you got to be really, really beautiful and in shape and really fit, or else because you got to prove that you're worthy of this person's time. Whatever it is, there's this system that gets into play, and what inevitably happens is it creates a very crisp system. Some win, some lose, some like it, some don't. This automatically happens when you live in this loop. It automatically happens. You get married and you go, you cook, I'll clean. You create a system, and that system is based on fairness. It's based on fairness. And when things aren't fair, it becomes a problem, and that problem then demands a solution. And if it doesn't get a solution, it gets a punishment. And that's the system we live in. You cook, I'll clean. You didn't clean, so now I'm going to withhold. I'm going to pout. I'm going to be mad. Whatever it is. And it's this problem because the fundamental problem is it's not fair. And this is what we end up living in all the time. And if we could just convince people that we're right, there's better evidence, perhaps they'll be able to let, when we get in this sort of cycle that gets to be stuck in these loops that just go over and over and over and over again. It is not so with the way of Jesus. This runs with a faith trust. We see something and we're invited to place the weight of our affection, the weight of our hopes, the weight of our longings in it, and then we find that it can sustain. We find that He can be trusted. What this fundamentally is, this is the governing system of a relationship that is so foreign to the way most of us think. A love relationship, a personal relationship with another person, and then certainly a personal relationship with our God through His Son, Jesus Christ. And then he goes on, and what happens out of this, the call isn't about fairness. The call is about fullness. It's about, is this other person becoming who they're called and created to be? Not do they have the opportunity to do it, but is it actually occurring? And the reason is because the promise that we operate under here is not a system that provides fairness. That's never going to happen. It's the idea that we live under the promise of redemption. What we've been saying in this, and we say that when people, we live as a people who are redeemed and are acting on the promise of redemption, it changes everything about the way you enter into the world and the world's problems. It changes the way you enter into the life of another person and their struggles. You see, when we think about this, people who live in the way of Jesus, poverty is met with dignity. Not with financial solutions, not with money. It's met with dignity first. Why? Because of the promise of God's hesed, of his love, of his, hesed is the Hebrew word. It's translated steadfast love or faithful love or loyal love, but it's more than it's pursuing love. It's a driving love. We've been talking about this, that love is a force that breathes worth and value. God comes to us and he breathes worth and value, causes us to come alive, to be full and to be free. The second one, brokenness. We enter brokenness with a sense of hope because of God's promise of redemption. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been through all kinds of the worst things with people. And I'll tell you what I as much as I hate it, it's hard and it's heartbreaking to enter in with people into very difficult circumstances, whether it's a health concern or maybe a terminal diagnosis, or whether it's a relationship that's coming to an end. It doesn't matter if they've been married for however many years or whatever, or if it's something that's just somebody's come apart at the seams. To enter into those places is always heartbreaking, it's always hard. But I'll tell you what I've learned, I'm never afraid anymore. Do you know why? Because there is no circumstance that threatens God's promise of redemption. There are lots of problems I can't solve. But there is no circumstance that cannot be redeemed. And so you don't have to be afraid to enter in and say, what's happening? What's going on? How can we enter into this together? Because there's something that God is doing in this. It's a way in which we live. This is what Jesus said he had come to do. He read from Isaiah chapter 61 when he began his ministry, and this is what he read. Isaiah 61, we've been using this over the last 4 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 counting today. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. And there are these 4 things: to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted. He has sent me to proclaim the freedom to captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. These 4 things: proclaim good news to the poor, sent to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and to release from darkness the prisoners. And so today we want to look at this idea of bondage. And in order, because Jesus said, if you abide in my word, you'll be my disciples. This doesn't mean if you keep all of the rules that he's established, you'll be his disciple. What it means is if we are willing to live in a relationship with him underneath his rule and reign, we will prove to be his disciples. That's what happens when you follow him. And in that, he says, you'll know the truth, and you will live and exist and experience the freedom for which you have been created to live. What would it feel like if you didn't have to prove yourself to another human being? How would that feel? Free, right? You feel like, oh my gosh, I can, because then what happens, a lot of things become available to you. Your call, your ability to give, your ability to offer yourself and avail yourself to others. This is what I want us to look at, and the promise comes like this. Bondage, this idea of bondage is met with freedom because of the promise of release. Of release. I love this word, release. It's like to let go, like let it go, let it go. Don't hold it back anymore. Now some of you you're not gonna be able, there's nothing else you're gonna be able to do. It's over. The promise of release. Release, and I love words, so I go and I look them up and look at their etymology and all that stuff and try to figure them out. And one of the things that's really interesting is that release simply means to stretch out again. To stretch out again. And I love it because it means that something has been either compressed or squished or squeezed or forced into something, some shape that it's not designed to be in, and to stretch it out again means it gets space and freedom to become what it was supposed to become. I think that's true of a lot of our lives. That's how Paul described it in Romans 12. Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, to be squeezed into these molds, but rather to be transformed. This release, this idea that we become something. It's also the root word of release is to relax, which some of you just need to just relax. Just relax. Relax, the word actually has a forcefulness to it. It literally means to be emphasized or forced into loosening. So it's like a reminder that you've got to do this. You've got to enter into this place to be released, to be relaxed. Something has to be done in order for this to happen. And so this idea of release, and what I want to suggest to you or submit to you, is when we think about the fact that this bondage is what we are stuck in, you've got to first understand, in order to be free, you've got to understand what it is that restrains you or stops you. And what a lot of people think is that what keeps you or your bondage, it's some symptom of some issue. It's anxiety, it's depression, it's something in your personality, it's something in your financial situation, it's some capacity that you sort of developed over time where you can't just quite seem to get ahead. You think that's what's holding you back, what's holding you imprisoned or enslaved. And what Jesus came and he said is it's not that at all. What keeps us enslaved is actually a rule or a system. That sin has mastery over us. This is so important for us to understand, right? It's so important for us to understand. The system that Jesus invites us to live in isn't about fairness towards another person, but rather it's about the fullness of every person. It is a relationship. You and I are designed to live in relationship with God and with other people. And if you're here and you're like, I'm not sure about the relationship with God thing, I think you can at least agree that we're designed to live in relationship with each other. And my problem is if we don't have a relationship with God, my submission is that you don't have a prayer, literally, for having a relationship with other people. And here's why. Because we are designed to live in relationship, and the redemption of this only lies in another system. It only exists in this system over here. The fullness and freedom of relationships only exists over here. And it begins only when you are restored to a relationship with the good Father, with your heavenly Father, which Jesus Christ came to do when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. He did not come to give you a ticket to get into heaven when you die. He came to restore you to the fundamental relationship for which you need and are created for in order to live in this world in the way you're intended to. That's what I believe about that. This is what Jesus came to do. And what he says is, and I want to show you this, in Colossians chapter 1, Paul wrote this. We're going to read this, it's going to be on the screens. It says, for he, Jesus Christ, or God, has rescued us from the dominion of darkness, and he has brought us into the kingdom of the Son whom he loves. Do you see what happened there? He has rescued us from one thing, and he has brought us into something else, something that looks quite strange and quite unfamiliar. He has rescued us from the dominion of darkness, forgive me, Patriots fans, and he has transferred us into something else. And for some of you, you're like, you can't stomach this, and I'll tell you why. For some of you, it's just because you're familiar. I showed this jersey, like, whose jersey is that? I said, it's Tom Brady's. I thought his jersey was blue. I'm like, well, it is, it was. He got traded. He played here for a lot of years, and now he got traded. Now he's a Tampa Bay Buccaneer. And other people have said, Tom Brady is not a Buccaneer. You know why? Because they love the Patriots. And they're mad and they're angry. And there's two reasons you don't buy into a new identity. Because either something is just so familiar you can't get used to the other, or you have an allegiance to the old that doesn't allow you to see the new. And here's the truth. Tom Brady is a Buccaneer. He is. Whether you like it or don't like it, whether you thought it was a good trade or a bad trade, whether you're a Patriots fan or you don't care, Tom Brady is a Buccaneer. It is very weird to those of us who watch football to see Tom Brady in an orange and red uniform. It's weird. And to see him not without this big old giant jacket on because he's always in Tampa, in New England, it's always freezing cold up there. But to see him in this warm weather playing for the Buccaneers. Now here's the truth. If Tom Brady plays for another 40 years, which is quite possible with Tom Brady. If he plays for another 40 years, do you know what will happen? Seeing him as a Patriot will be a really distant memory. And you will actually begin to think of him only as a Buccaneer. Do you know why? Because it will become more normal and less foreign. Right now, it's going to be weird because it is still more foreign and less normal. And the only way for that to shift is to focus on it, to look at it, to live in it, to understand that this is the reality in which you're living. Y'all, the same thing is true over here. The reason this seems so weird to us is because it's just so unfamiliar to us. We have familiarity with this system. We know how to make it work for us. We know how to get our way in this system. For some of us, we actually have really strong allegiances to this system, and we don't want them to be let go of. What Jesus says is he's actually made literally a trade. He took you out of one organization that is darkened, and I'm just kidding. And he put you in another one. And he put you in another one. You've been rescued from one thing and placed into another. And look at what he says. I love the way he ends this. This is just so profound to me. He's brought us into the kingdom of the Son whom he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sin. All right, you see what he just did there? He just like took the cups, so which ball is it under? And then you switch around and say, oh, whoa. How in the world did redemption and forgiveness of sin get in the same equation? This is what is so intriguing to me, I think so important for us. A lot of times we talk about forgiveness, I want to be really, really clear. What I'm going to share with you in the next few minutes, you cannot use this as a weapon to hit someone who you are not in a right relationship with because you have wronged them and say, well, if you heard what Mike said, you would forgive me. If you are using it as a weapon, you are abusing it. Okay, I want to be really, really clear. Because to understand this, oftentimes we misunderstand forgiveness because we get fearful about it because it means that someone can take advantage of us or someone can exploit us or someone can use us or someone just dadgummit is going to get away with something they shouldn't get away with. And we have that within our realm to make them pay. And so forgiveness is really, really hard and really, really tricky. The reason is, I think, because forgiveness is often stuck in the wrong system. Most of us have thought about this. We've heard 1 John 1:9, right? If we confess our sins, he is faithful and he is just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And so we're like, oh, forgiveness. I said a bad word. I'll confess it. And guess what happened? You just balance the scales and now it's fair. One sin, one confession. You said, oh my gosh, I was in traffic and I called that dude a jerk. I'll confess that, and then I get forgiveness for that thing. I had a really bad thought about Mike because he made fun of the Patriots, and I'll ask forgiveness for that, and then I get another one. And you have this sort of one-to-one idea of forgiveness, and perhaps if you've done something really bad, you just sort of give yourself some tick marks over here like, man, that was worth at least like 10 sins. And then you just kind of have to add it up over here. And maybe you'll even feel really bad and you'll punish yourself for a few more weeks or a few more months, or you'll try to go on some streak. I'm not going to do this again for like as long as I can. You start counting the days. Why? Because you got forgiveness in the wrong system. So if you've lived like this over and over and you wonder if you're saved, I remind you, we've been transferred from one system to another. You cannot overlay the old system on the new. This idea of forgiveness is so important for us to understand. Forgiveness is not see, what happens over here is the way this gets done, this prove model, it still gets done, justice gets done like this. Over here, it gets done like this. And this is so radically different. Forgiveness is not a system. Forgiveness, I don't know how else to draw this, but for when we are ushered into this relationship with God, by faith, he has forgiven us. We have received forgiveness, and it now is a state in which we live. We live as one who has been forgiven. Do you know what that means? You do not owe anything. Period. Period. You don't owe more of these. Somehow something in here allows us the safety and the freedom to become who it is that we are to become. And the promise of redemption begins or is rooted in the state of forgiveness that we've received. I want to see if I can give you a story from the life of Simon Peter. We've talked about him a lot in this message, but I want to give you one more caveat and say this as strongly as I can. If you think that forgiveness is a license to continue to do what you want to do, I want you to hear me very carefully. If you think that because you are forgiven, that means your spouse or your boyfriend or girlfriend or your parents are just not going to be mad anymore, if you think that forgiveness is a license for you to continue to do what you want, you do not understand forgiveness, you do not understand grace, and you do not understand what it means to live in a relationship. What you have learned and what you do understand is how to create a system that you can use to get what you want, and that is the problem. That is exactly the problem that I'm talking about, because you are using a system to preserve your way, which is the exact opposite of what we have been transferred from and into. Is that clear? The reason this is so important for us to get, because if we don't understand this as a state in which we live, we're either going to continue this sort of apology theology, which is what Andrew Farley calls it, or we're going to live over here and just take advantage of a relationship that is so beautiful and never experience the freedom and the fullness. If we abide in His word, which means we come under His rule, we're His disciples, we'll know the truth, and the truth will set us free. So y'all know Simon Peter, right? Simon Peter was kind of the brash apostle. He was the one that when Jesus was being arrested, he pulled out a sword and he cut off the guy's ear. You may be familiar with that story if you've read through the Gospels. He cut off the guy's ear. Now people think, oh, that's pretty aggressive. He's probably aiming for his neck. He's just a fisherman and not a warrior. So he missed and hit his ear. Jesus puts it back on, heals him, and then says, put your sword up. Peter is always the one to kind of go first, right? If Jesus comes to walk on the water, he says, Lord, if it's you, let me come. And Peter gets to walk on the water. Peter was the one who was always like, Lord, this is not going to happen to you. We learned this last week when Jesus is like, hey, I'm going to be killed and in 3 days raised from the dead. And Peter's like, no, you're not. That's a dumb idea. And Jesus rebukes him and says, get behind me, Satan, for your mind is not set on the things of God. Peter was forever putting his foot in his mouth, saying stuff. And we find him at the Last Supper in John chapter 13 recorded for us. And he's just telling, Jesus is like, I'm going to die. And he says, one of you is going to betray me. Peter's like, it ain't going to be me. I'd die for you. Jesus says, where I'm going, you can't go. And Peter's like, I'll go anywhere. I'll die for you. And here's what Jesus says to him in John chapter 13, verse 38. He says, then Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. Some of you may be familiar with this story, this encounter with Peter. That he gets this and he denies Jesus 3 times before the rooster crows, right before Jesus is crucified and then his subsequent resurrection. And I want us to just enter in what that would feel like for Jesus to look at you and say, you're going to mess this up. You think you're going to do one thing, but you're actually going to do something else. Luke kind of gives us this account of how this unfolds and what the experience, and we get the emotion of Peter. In Luke chapter 22, it says, after Jesus was arrested, when they seized him, verse 54, and they led him away, bringing him to the high priest's house where he was going to be sort of this sham of a trial. And it says that Peter was following him at a distance. Peter was behind him. Peter was not far enough away where he wasn't noticed, but he wasn't close enough to be identified with him. He was kind of in no man's land. If you know the story, it says Peter's sitting there and someone says, aren't you one of the disciples and didn't you know him? And he does this 3 times and each time he denies him. And here's the last denial and how it's recorded. Luke chapter 22, verse 60. It says, but Peter says to the man in response to his, don't you know this man? He says, man, I don't know what you're talking about. And immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Try to imagine that scene where Jesus is being flogged and he's probably already been spit on and hit. And he turns and he sees Peter as he hears the rooster crow, and he can just see him just off at a little distance. And Peter knows immediately what he's done. And then Peter remembered the saying of the Lord that he had said, before the rooster crows today, you'll deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. He went out and he said, I've done the unthinkable. What is my life now? Right? Some of you, this is what you chronically live in. because you've done some things and you just can't figure out how in the world you're going to get these scales to balance. How in the world you're ever going to get this righted in order to be somebody. You've done the unthinkable. You committed to something and you didn't follow through. You promised God you wouldn't do something and then you did it anyway. Or whatever your story is. I want to show you what's so cool about this and what's I think the promise and the hope for forgiveness for all of us is that John mentions these subtle details in his account. John was probably one of the last to write his gospel down and seems to be a little bit more interested in the message of who Jesus was, and it's a beautiful way it's written. In John chapter 18, John makes this note about where Peter denies Jesus. And he says, now the servants and the officer had made a charcoal fire. And in the Greek language, this word is only used twice. This word for charcoal fire is only used twice. You know charcoal fire has a pretty unique, distinct smell, right? When your neighbors start to cook up their gas grill, it's not that big of a deal. They light a charcoal fire, you're like, man, something's different about that. It's a charcoal fire. He makes note of this. He says, because it was cold and they were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was also with them, standing there and warming himself. This is where the denials happened. So you can imagine, he denies Jesus, sees Jesus in the distance, and he goes off, and he's beside himself. It's the last exchange he has with Jesus until John 21. I want you to think about your own life, right? Some of you, your distance from Jesus is because of something that you've done or something you think he's disappointed in or something you think you've blown it with. And you're trying to figure out, maybe you're like here today because you're like, man, if I just go to church, then maybe somehow I can equal this scale back out. Some of you have been punishing yourself for a long time. You realize that self-harm and cutting is more and more prevalent in the next generation. Do you know why? Because we're trying to figure out how in the world I'm so worthless and so unworthy. How can I make myself feel the pain that I deserve? Or the fact that I'm so numb that at least I can feel something because I'm so unworthy to feel anything good. You know what you need in that? You don't need 3 steps to fix yourself. You need for someone to grab you by the face and to breathe worth and value into your soul so that you come alive. That's what you need. That's exactly what Jesus came to do. I want to show you how he invites Peter back in. Now, one more thing you need to know about Peter. Peter was a fisherman, had grown up as a fisherman. And the way Peter meets Jesus, I love this. It's found in Luke 5. Peter meets Jesus because Jesus is teaching a crowd, and Peter is coming back in from all-night fishing. And he pulls his boat up to the shore, and Jesus is there, and he's teaching the folks, and he says, hey, Peter, sir, can I use your boat so I can pull out of the way and address this crowd a little bit more effectively? That's how they did it back then. Because I guess the water and the shore gave them a little bit of space and allowed them to project their voice. That'd be kind of cool to preach like that today. Get on a boat and just talk to a bunch of people on the beach. Hey, y'all, hope, but that's what he's doing. And when he's done with the crowd, he turns around to Peter and he says, hey, why don't you push out a little further and then let your nets back down? And Peter looks at him and is like, hey, dude, you're a rabbi. Why don't you stick to teaching and let me stick to fishing? But I guess since you ask, I'll do it. He goes and he throws his nets and he said, we've caught nothing all night. So this is the heat of the day. This is probably a really bad idea, but I'll entertain this rabbi guy so he can think he's doing something. They pull it over, they lift the nets up, and the fish load is so big it almost sinks the boats. Peter turns and he says to him, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man. He gets on his knees and Jesus says, I want you to come and follow me. I'll make you fishers of men. That's Peter's introduction, this massive catch of fish. So now we find Peter 3 years later. He's denied Jesus, hasn't seen him since. Now Jesus has appeared to the disciples after his resurrection. You know Peter has undoubtedly heard this. And when all that good is going on over there, what do you think Peter's feeling? Just salt in the wound, missed it. What I could have been doing if I hadn't have blown it in that moment, I could have been there instead of here. And so you know what it looks like he does? He goes back to what he knew, back to what he was familiar with, back to what he had former allegiances to. Does this sound like anybody's story? When you just feel like you've blown it, you just go back to where you were over and over again, just because it's familiar or just because it feels good or just because it's an escape from the guilt that you feel from looking at this one. So that's where Peter is. He's fishing. And it says his friends are with him. And here's the account. I love this. John chapter 21. There's so much about this whole section I wish I could tell you. John chapter 21, just as the day was breaking, Jesus comes and he stands on the shore, and his disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus says to them, children, do you have any fish? So that's like a term of like, it's like, hey guys, do y'all have any fish? And they said, no, we've been out and we haven't caught any fish. And he says to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. So they cast on the other side of the net and they pull in this massive haul of fish. Now Peter's probably going, I've seen this before. I've seen this movie before. And that disciple whom Jesus loved, which is John, that's how John refers to himself, looks to Peter and he says, hey, it's the Lord. I think John knew that Peter needed this. He said, hey, dude, that's Jesus. And Peter's like, dude, I thought so. The fish reminded, like, I thought so. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had stripped for work, and he threw himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in on the boat, dragging the net full of fish, and they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. So Peter jumps off. He sees Jesus. He jumps off the boat and gets to Jesus as fast as he can. He's not thinking about the coal, he's not thinking about the denial. He's just like, I got to get to Jesus. Do you know why? Because I think he understands that there's a relationship there. And I love this. Only 2 times is this word charcoal fire used in the New Testament. And here's the second one, verse 9. When they got to land, they saw a charcoal fire and the fish laid out. Think about Peter. John, hey dude, I think it's Jesus. Shoo, splash, splash, splash. He gets up there. And what does he smell? Charcoal fire. I think I've smelled that before. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. You know what Jesus does? He calls him aside and he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, Lord, you know I do. He says, I want you to feed my lambs. Jesus asks him again, Peter, do you love me? Peter says, Lord, you know that I love you. He says, I want you to feed my sheep. He asks him a third time, Peter, do you love me? And at this, Peter was just broken. He says, I want you to tend my lambs. You're going to be a pillar in my movement. You're going to lead and eventually turn the world upside down. Here's what I want you to understand. A lot of us are so afraid to come to Jesus because you think that he's going to condemn you. When Peter got there, Jesus made no bones about it. I think it was very intentional. He smelled that fire and he knew what he had done. And the reason Jesus did this is not to condemn him for his sin, but to remind him that he had been freed from the bondage that sin represents and held. Do you understand how powerful that is? Well, a lot of us are afraid because we're afraid we're going to feel guilty about what we've done, and so we withhold it or we justify it or we hold on to these chains that have long since been broken. Because you're either trying to demonstrate to God how sorry you are for what you've done, or you think maybe if you just drag them along further, that punishment will suffice. And it's like, no, I've transferred you from one kingdom to the other so that you have redemption, the forgiveness of your sins. You live in a state of being forgiven. Sometimes I think the hardest thing for us to believe is that we just have to believe. You're trying to figure out what evidence you can come up with to prove that you're serious about your faith. And he's like, I just want you to trust me. If I said you're free, if I said you're forgiven, can you trust that? Can you trust that? The thing that I think is most radical about Jesus over anything else that the world has ever seen is his radical invitation to simply come. Just to show up. Just to come. This just doesn't seem right, does it? It just seems weird. Well, I'm telling you, it does. But as we fix our eyes on him and his way, and we learn to walk in it each day, and as broken in the patterns as it might be, it will become more normal and less foreign. And it will be way more important than whether Tom Brady wins his Super Bowl with the Buccaneers, which I think he's going to do. Just kidding. More normal, less foreign. Some of you are so afraid to say what's really going on, the struggles you're really having. You've justified it. You've tried to hold on to it. You've tried to pretend it didn't happen. If we confess our sins, it says, this isn't like giving a list to make sure you get one forgiveness for everything you list. This is about just saying, you just jump in the ocean and you swim and you say, here I am. Whatever he brings to mind, he's bringing to mind, not to condemn you for it, but to remind you that that bond, those chains have been broken. Sin is what keeps us separated from God, and that is the very thing that Jesus came to destroy. So there is no longer any separation between you and the relationship for which you've been made. There is no longer any condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So don't be afraid to come. It is his radical invitation to come that makes him unique of every system that the world has ever seen. So stop justifying when you realize that you don't have to prove anything to God and that you don't owe him anything. You'll be free from proving and demanding and all the cycles that we get stuck in. And I think therein have a shot at being a part of the redemptive promise that God has for the world around us. If you're here and you're struggling, come to Jesus. If you're here and you have a friend who is struggling, don't be afraid to have a conversation with them. You're not condemning them. You're reminding them. Jesus came to set us free. If we abide in his word, if we live under his rule, we will know the truth, and that truth will set us free. We're going to close with a song that's been one of my kind of go-tos for 4 or 5 years. I just love the imagery, kind of the authority in the song. It just reminds us that Jesus changes everything. I think we say that, we don't realize how radically, fundamentally different the way of Jesus is from anything else that we're used to living in. We're familiar and we've got obligations and allegiances. But he's transferred us from one into another. I hope we'll have eyes to see that. What he says, and the line of the song is that chains fall and fear bows. And for some of you, the chains need to fall simply because you're willing to let them go. You've been holding on to them far too long. What I did in the first service, I had some friends who were here with me, and they're fighting. And when I sang this song, it's lives healed, hope found, I just said, God, I'm just fighting for them. I'm lifting them. I'm singing this with them. God, do something in them. We need to encounter him, to see him. And for some of you, you just need to come. Stop justifying. Stop rationalizing. Stop dying. Just come. Father, I ask in these next few moments that there will be just sort of a moment, a space, whether we're at home with kids and there would be maybe some calm or quiet there, or the distractions of being in a room, that they would just kind of dissipate for just a moment as we realize that we are meeting you here. And maybe Jesus makes a charcoal fire. Maybe he does some things that remind us of some of the things that we've been concealing or hiding or running from. And Father, it's not to be condemned, it's to be freed. You are faithful and you are just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So God, just meet us and speak to us and minister to us in whatever way we need in these moments. And I'll lift this in the name of your Son, who is our King.